his dad worked. His dad was an avid gardener, and a place where he often asked about his dad because he could be able to see down on the fields below where he gardened. And on the way there, I quite vividly remember him saying, "I must see my dad today." So I really made a conscious decision and took advice, and the one thing that stuck in my head was that what I needed to say needed to be really simple as I possibly could. So I started with real honesty and said that your dad got really poorly because his heart had stopped working, and that we all needed a heart that works to keep us alive. And I asked him if he understood that. And then I went on to say that sometimes something in your body stops working. And he said, "Yeah, okay, yeah." And I said, "And it can't be fixed." And then I said that the doctors couldn't fix his dad's heart, and sadly he died. And he didn't say a lot straight away, and I think that's quite difficult. He just wanted to go and play and go and do his stuff, and the wind was blowing, and he was kind of interested in the world around him. But I was very aware that it was in his head. And expressive language isn't something that autistic children, and certainly children with sensory disorders, find easy to do. So the first few days he had a lot of questions. I had to reassure him a heck of a lot in words and actions, physically as well as saying things to him that, and he was worried about so many things. He wanted to say goodbye but didn't understand that he couldn't say goodbye to a person. He was quiet, very clingy, and interestingly he had a lot of pains in his chest, and I'm not sure if he knew what a heart attack would feel like or what heart pain would be, or that chest pain's associated with a heart attack, but he certainly had symptoms that were pains in his chest. And I really did show my emotions and showed him how I felt as well, and we talked about his dad when he wanted to in those first few days. I did a lot of planning and preparation in the background when I managed to get him to sleep because he wasn't sleeping very well. I got in touch with his school because obviously they were off on Easter holidays. I contacted Cerebra, which are a charity supporting children with additional needs connected to cerebral difficulties, including autism. And I borrowed their additional needs bereavement books, and they sent those out first class, and I was able to send them back free, which you can with all their books. I started applying for some sensory equipment at home, contacted my local library to find some books that might help him understand grief and death and loss. And I started to create a social story for the funeral, planning ahead for about, I think it was about 10 days afterwards. But I also realised that he needed a lot more sensory input from me and the world around him, and that was because he was increasing in aching and pain, not just in his chest but kind of all over. And he didn't want food that needed chewing or had a strong smell or taste, very bland food and things that just took no effort. And he was really oversensitive to light and sound. If he heard a car going by that beeped its horn, he would, unusually for him, reacts quite significantly by running, and we hadn't had that for many years since he was kind of preschool age. He was definitely more hyperactive than usual, even with medication, and like I say, he was struggling to sleep. So what did I do? I just kind of went with my heart and applied pressure to his back and feet. Sometimes the pressure felt like I was going to bust his ribs because he wanted pressing on his back. And rocking the hips, used a wheat bag around his neck just to keep some heat and some weight on his neck, and provided simple food that didn't need a knife and fork, soft food, things that he could pick at, things that were out on the table that he could choose from. I got a sensory pod and swing in the garden that I borrowed. I got him out painting water on the paving stones with little paintbrushes, big paintbrushes, and he just gave all his energy to painting anything he wanted, and digging in the garden and really connecting with the earth. And I'm a real passionate advocate of connecting with the ground and soil and those fragile, crumbly, stones and plants. I managed to get him eventually a sensory blanket. I put a little radio, a little digital radio on at night so he had noise, and I had a bump light that you bump to make a soft glow, so he didn't have to press a light, he could just bump it if he didn't feel that he was coordinated enough to press a light switch. These are him in action. These are things we do. That is him in a box about 3 days after the bereavement. And that's what he wanted to do. And you could suggest that's really entombing someone, or looks like someone's in a coffin, perhaps. I'm not sure. I didn't really question what he was doing. I just let him be himself and just was around and accepted what he was doing. He's painting away there and in a great big puddle. Took him up to some horses, and he did some equine assisted therapy for about 7 weeks. It was really interesting, this, because he was so loud and hyperactive, more unusually than normal, and the horse turned into a corner in the stable and wouldn't even look at him, and he had to moderate his behaviour and his body language until it came with him. And that's a session much later on where the same horse that was very young and very nervy, very nervous, was following him round, and he had no lead, he had no way of encouraging that horse to go round an obstacle course, but he achieved it, and that was his understanding of how his behaviour affects other people. And we walked the dog a lot. I must add that all of the photos, you probably wouldn't be able to recognise my son from this, and I've got his permission to share these photos too. And it was a decision we made together to do this presentation. So returning to school was a bit of a challenge. He came to the funeral, and we went back to school shortly afterwards. School were really supportive. They asked about what he knew, what I told him, what he had asked about previously, and how I'd approach questions, and they very much mirrored what I said, and they communicated with us both in a really sensitive and encouraging way, and they weren't afraid to ask questions or say that they didn't know, and they increased his sensory diet opportunities in school through various activities. I guess what I really valued was 2 things that were perhaps different to what other schools could do depending on what's available, but they created a place for him to go to, and this was if he needed some space or was just a bit overloaded by the classroom. He was in junior school, he was in year 5, so there was still that formal aspect to the classroom. And the teachers, mainly one teacher, but occasionally a stand-in, knew we could leave the room without any explanation or warning. And head teacher, her office had a small area, and she put in a comfy chair. There's a little bookcase in the middle, some cushions, books to read, a little radio and some plants. And it was somewhere we could sit, or others could sit actually, and I believe it's still used to this day if they just needed some space. And she didn't ask questions, didn't put him under any stress or cause any anxiety, but acknowledged if he was there, which I think was important. Now you'd think that all that was lots, but there was also the learning environment to consider, because you don't want a child to be coming in and out of a learning environment if they don't need to. So there was a cushion on his chair to soften the seat, a bit of Velcro stuck under the desk so he could get some sensory feedback by just touching it. Really effective of getting him to sit in his seat, and also just keeping some movement going. He was able to run around the field to let off a bit of steam. And the whole class was encouraged to share their emotions with a tree in the middle, and they put on in the morning how they were feeling, and teachers would be able to understand the feeling of the class as a whole. They moved his seat because it was directly under the light. It hadn't bothered him before, but he was very aware of the light. You know, the overstimulation was very easy for him. And did a lot of small group work to build his confidence, and he was given a choice to go out at lunchtime or breaks. He wasn't handling direct praise and positivity very well, and it was causing some minor meltdowns, so support with praise and positivity was done indirectly in his earshot rather than directly to him, and they give a real strong routine. Things remain normal. The person to go to was really different. It was actually the person who spoke to most was the school caretaker, which was just wonderful that school were able to think outside the box, really. They did a bit of planting and digging together at lunchtime and at breaks, and they worked together on little projects like dismantling an old desk that needed dismantling to put out for the council to take away. And they cleaned windows, and those school windows were never cleaner. And they just chatted alongside pottering. Sometimes they chatted about his dad, sometimes they chatted about how he was feeling, sometimes they just chatted about man stuff and digging and screwdrivers and the like, which was lovely, actually. There was always a teacher around or a support assistant around. They did have one-to-one, but they much left him to be himself. Outside school, it was really important to give him reassurance for how he's feeling, because the pains he had in his chest were very real to him, and the GP gave him a great check-up and reassured him it was okay. And sometimes his thoughts just bubbled up, and he told people he didn't even know that his dad died. I can remember being in Tesco's at the checkout with my son, and the first person he told that his dad had died was the checkout operator, who was lovely and was taken completely by surprise. But you could always guarantee that they'll take people by surprise with what they want to say. And anger bubbled to the surface very quickly at times. So I had to really reduce the expectations of what expected from him behaviourally. And he became quite withdrawn and needed encouragement to go out and about. He was actually picked on in a school holiday club by other children because they found out that his dad had died, which was handled really sensitively by the manager of the school holiday club. And they got the kids together, and I think the other kids were just scared that something similar might happen to them. So who helped us? School, definitely, and some local parent support groups, a local gardening group which give us the time and space to just go and dig and climb trees together. And other children, adults who had been bereaved of a significant person helped too. And the picture there, which looks possibly a little odd, is actually a whirlpool, a jacuzzi that we had on Torbay Holiday Helpers Network, which is a short break of 7 days with lots of activities for free. They can also provide funding to get down there. And we stayed in a caravan and built memories together. It's called a Memory Makers Caravan. And that night we sat in the jacuzzi together watching the ducks, who was tucking up for the night with a nice breeze over our heads, and just talked about his dad. And that's one of the most lasting memories we have about the difficulties we had that year. So a little bit of positivity, I guess. The garden that he'd planned with his dad was started and was finished, and I was with him in the garden this weekend putting some more plants in. But this is where it was in the very early week that we started to do it, and this was in the summer holidays following the Easter when his dad died, and we created it together. We created according to the plan that he'd made with his dad, and it's a place, like I say, we still go together to share memories or just be thoughtful. Added a lot of sensory features into it: smells, lavender, tactile butterfly plants and raspberry canes that you can just hear rustle in the wind. Beautiful, beautiful place. And there was a lot of car tyres. You might be able to see them on the right hand side. We put strawberry plants in there, so you'll often find him on a sunny night or even a wet night as well, sat there eating his strawberries, just having a moment to himself. So there were some later challenges, and we still have some challenges. Family tree and history, Father's Day, when others become unwell at home and he worries that something's going to happen to them. Birthdays and anniversaries. Unfortunately, his dad's birthday is on a significant day in the calendar year, so it's well remembered. Wanting to still see his dad, and watching and asking about letters and cards from his dad even now, over 4 years later. And holidays, for some interesting reason, he finds holidays really difficult, possibly because the bereavement happened during a significant holiday on the calendar. So I wondered if you had any questions for me.
It doesn't look like we've got any questions at the moment, but thank you so much for sharing it. If anyone does have any questions, please do just type them up in the questions box, or alternatively just drop me an email and we can pass those on for you. But if there is anything that you'd like to know further or any information, it looks like you might have a question.
Oh, thank you. That's lovely, Sandy. I do my best. It's a challenge day to day, and every teenager is a challenge. But he is a real joy, and I think his dad would be very proud of him.
But if anyone would have any further questions, do feel free to send them across, or I'm sure we could answer some later on as well. But thank you very much for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Any questions at all, I don't mind answering. We all learn from each other, and I think the journey of bereavement is very different with an additional needs child, but there's so much you can do, and I think if we all share together, the only people that are going to benefit are young people with additional needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to our next speaker, who's Professor Sue Read from the University of Keele.
Okay.
Hi, Sue.
Hi there. Are we ready?
I'm just going to change you to the presenter, so we should hopefully be able to see your slides up on the screen now.
Have you got it?
Yes, we do. That's perfect. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I nearly logged out then. Sorry. Right, ready when you are.
Yeah, that looks good to go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Good afternoon, everybody. And how to follow such a powerful presentation, so grounded and full of creative and practical ideas. So thank you so much for sharing that before my presentation. So my name is Sue Read. My background is working with people with a learning disability. So I've worked with people since 1975, and my particular area of interest is around loss, bereavement and end-of-life care, particularly looking at psychosocial and emotional support. So how do we engage with people who have problems with cognition and problems with memory and problems with learning?
It's easy to talk about your own death. It's harder to talk about other people. I'd like to know so I confirm things. Once you are dead, you are dead. That's life.
Okay, so in this short presentation, I'm going to try and provide an introduction, background and rationale to the bereavement world of people with a learning disability. Try and catalogue some of the challenges when supporting people with disabilities, particularly focused on disenfranchised grief and death, which I'll explain later, and to critically explore the concept, nature and meaning of support associated with loss and death, and look at some of the recognised barriers. But I guess I also want to demonstrate that people with learning disability can indeed teach us so much about death and dying, and that's why some of the pictures, some of the audio clips, some of the video clips, they're all taken from some of the work I've been involved with over the years in working very much in co-production with people with a learning disability themselves. So how would we define learning disability? And the Department of Health documents tell us that it's about a person who has a reduced ability to understand new or complex information, they struggle to learn new skills, they may have a reduced ability to cope independently, and it had to have started before adulthood with a lasting effect of development. So quite a long-winded but social definition about learning disability. The majority of people with a learning disability don't have a discrete learning disability. So they don't have Down syndrome or Cri-du-Chat syndrome. They simply have a learning disability. So this means that we're dealing with a population that sit on a continuum of variability. So you might have some people with profound disabilities and some people with very minimal disabilities, but they all have a disability or a learning disability. If you talk to people with a learning disability, they don't like the long and complicated definitions. So a very close friend of mine named Carl, he describes himself as having a disability means you do things a bit slower, you find it difficult to understand big words and concentrating, but we can still do what other people can do. So I think that's a really important issue, really. At the end of the day, people with disability can do largely what other people can do too. It might take them a bit longer to get there. So people with learning disability are, it's highly recognised that they are more likely to function on a developmental level that is inconsistent with their chronological age. So adults may not function as fully functioning adults. They carry a history of marginalisation, devaluation and stigma. So with regards to attitudes to death and dying and end-of-life care and particularly access to hospitals, 3 important documents came out in the last few years. So the first one was Treat Me Right, that was 2004, MenCap document. And that identified that people with disability, when they go to the hospital or the doctors, they may need longer appointments, they might need support, they might need to have an appointment at the end of the day rather than the beginning because they get quite anxious sometimes, waiting in busy doctor's surgeries. So it identifies some of the challenges around accessing everyday support that you and I would access from the GP or from the local hospital. The Death by Indifference report, which followed a few years later, this is about 6 people who died in hospital, and MenCap argued that these people shouldn't really have died. They had a learning disability, and some of them had very simplistic issues like a broken leg. Other people had a stroke, another person was diagnosed with cancer. They were very young, some of these people, but the circumstances in which they died were quite traumatic in some cases. And this was a really pivotal document for the world of learning disability because they demanded that they had an independent inquiry into how these people died, and eventually the Ombudsman report came out in response to that document. If you're interested in disability and you're interested in these documents, please download the easy read version of any of them. Instead of having a 30-page report with lots of complex words in them, they come in at half a dozen pages with some pictures, and it says exactly the same as the very in-depth report. So if you're interested and your world is not focused on disability, you might find it easier, more easier to understand the issues really, if you download some of the easy read or clear information documents that MenCap always offer. And then the final report on the screen, Death by Indifference, 74 deaths and still counting. This was a follow-up to the initial report in 2007, in which they identify another 74 deaths of people with disability. And again, they're arguing about the circumstances and the nature of the deaths, and why people with disability are dying in such strange and uncomfortable situations. Just coincidentally, the title Death by Indifference, I believe, was coined by a parent who approached MenCap following the Treat Me Right document to say, my son, my daughter, my whatever, had a terrible experience in hospital. Let me tell you my story. So MenCap brought a group of people together, and one of the parents said, really, it's death by indifference because general nurses, the general healthcare system in England, they have a real ambivalence around people with disability, and we wonder whether they really understand it enough and whether they really understand the quality of life associated with disability and whether they really fundamentally care whether people with a disability actually live or die. And that's where I believe the title came from. So we have a history, people with disability generally have a history of marginalisation, devaluation and stigma associated with the label of learning disability. But my argument has always been that people with a learning disability have more similarities to us than differences from us, particularly within the loss, death and bereavement context. So if we take that similarity issue a little bit further, I think there are 3 particular times when a person with a learning disability is more similar to us than different from us. So one of those times is at birth. So on the screen you'll see 3 pictures of some people who are very close to me. So one is a picture of my son who has cerebral palsy. He's now 32. His only disability really, apart from physical disabilities of walking appropriately, is that he follows Stoke City Football Club. So that's his main disability, really. Another picture is of my niece, who's now 16. And then there's one picture of a very close friend, her daughter, named Jane. Jane had Rett syndrome. And people with Rett syndrome normally live into young adulthood, so into their early 20s. Jane lived until she was 40. So she had a fantastic life. And Rett syndrome is a very degenerative disease or disorder. So Jane was born perfectly normal in the broadest sense of the term. And eventually it was discovered by the age of 3 that there was a problem somewhere. And her mother spent the rest of their life together trying to combat some of the challenges of living with a deteriorating condition with a young person in the home. We actually helped her to write an article, Living with Shattered Dreams, with having a daughter in the family who was significantly different. Another time when I think that people with disability have more similarities to us than differences from us is as old age approaches. So people tell me that as I get older, I'll get more tolerant, and I'll take things a bit more slowly. Well, I'm not very tolerant. I get very impatient because life's passing me by so quickly. So I'm not as tolerant as maybe I could be. On the screen you'll see 2 slides. One is my elderly parents, both of which died of cancer, and then one of which is a person I met with a learning disability many years ago. And this young lady, I think she is a bit younger than me now. She had one of the most peaceful deaths I've ever witnessed, and she died of cancer. She died at home, and she died with a nail varnish on her painted fingernails and toenails. She had her hair done. She was in bed. She was at peace, and she had her 2 cats lying on her feet. She didn't go into hospital. She stayed where she wanted to be, which is at home. And then the final time, I think, is at the end of life, because most people, if we ask them, they don't want to die in pain. I don't think many people are afraid of death. They're afraid of the dying bit. So they're afraid of how they're going to die, the nature of that dying, who's going to be with them, maybe afraid of dying on their own. They obviously don't want to be in pain or discomfort, if at all possible. And they want to be as human and with dignity as is feasibly possible. And the challenge we have, I guess, is that many people with a learning disability can't articulate that in the way that I have just articulated it. But in my experience, at the end of life, most people want the same things. That doesn't change just because you have an altered cognition or difficulty in comprehending. What does change is that that person may not have the ability to communicate in a way that is meaningful to the people who are providing that care for them. So their needs and wants at the end of life may be significantly different from what they actually would prefer. So if we looked at loss, and we don't have a lot of time to focus on all this stuff, but if we looked at loss generally, this is a picture of Terrigal Beach, actually, in Australia. I got stranded there under the volcanic ash cloud a few years back and spent a lot of time on this beach, which was deserted, just writing and thinking. It was a shame not to be able to get home, but it was a wonderful experience. And if we thought about loss, Neil Thompson tells us that life is characterized by movement, change and development, and therefore by transition, losses and grief. So all our life we are confronted with loss. And Maureen Oswin talks about loss. Either we're thinking about it because it's happened to us previously, either we're experiencing it and we're thinking about it, either we're reflecting on losses that have happened before, or we're anticipating the losses in the future. So Maureen Oswin talks about loss being omnipresent. It's always around us, and we can't shield anybody from the loss experience. But sometimes people think they can shield people from the impact of loss, which I think is very difficult to do. So loss can be described as a sense of being deprived or being without, and as such can be expected or unexpected. So if you're a student nurse and you're revising for your exams and you revise the wrong text, then you'll be really surprised to find that you have failed your exams because you read the wrong books but you really thought you were on track. However, if you're a student nurse and you didn't revise at all, then the outcome of failing one of your exams maybe is fully expected and anticipated. So that won't be as much as a shock as it could have been. More recently, Linda Machin talks about different types of grief. She talks about different types of loss. She talks about developmental loss, and this is loss that everybody experiences generally over time. So that could be moving house, changing schools, divorce maybe, growing older. And she talks about circumstantial loss, which could be things that happen to you. So that could be road traffic accident, that could be losing limbs, it could be having severe ill health. And then she talks about invisible grief. And the invisible grief aspect is where people don't recognise the grief in the lives of others. And I think that people with learning disability are often sort of given this context of invisible grief. We often don't see the grief, we often don't feel the pain, we often don't support the grief because of its invisibility. For the majority of people, loss is dealt with within the person's immediate social context, with help and support sought from friends and family and work colleagues. So thankfully, the majority of people do not need bereavement counsellors or psychotherapy or referral to a mental health charity or any of those additional support areas. Some people may be described as having complicated or prolonged grief, and that's about where people struggle, often unsuccessfully, to re-establish their lives without the dead person and to reconstruct their shattered dreams when somebody who was very central to that dream is no longer with them. So for a small percentage of people, there is the need for more specific professional help and support, and that can be from a range of different sources. And for some groups of people, such as people with learning disability, accessing support means that their grief work can be left unsupported and unresolved. And sadly, for many years, I've been supporting people with disability many people who have had their loss and grief specifically unresolved. So the dead and dying have much in common with people with learning disability in terms of social responses to them, a response that has been based upon exclusion and broken bonds. So not many people like to talk about death and dying. In fact, many people don't talk about death in our culture. We now talk about passed away. So I think sometimes it's about the uncomfortableness, about the language that we use that can be the initial barriers to how we approach death and dying generally. And our major challenge for many people is the acceptance of death as a natural part of life by families, by our patients, ourselves, and indeed by our culture. Unfortunately, for people with learning disabilities, sudden death is the most difficult death to accommodate. And perhaps this is because of unfinished business, not being able to say goodbye, the fact that sudden death is often traumatic death. And I guess we try and look for reasons and rationales, etc. So for many people with learning disability, even though death could be anticipated, for example, if one of the parents has dementia and is in the late stage of dementia or has cancer, then we can anticipate that death is fast approaching. Quite often we don't involve the person with a disability in preparing them that death is going to be the outcome. So even though we could have prepared people, we often don't. So even though sudden death is the hardest loss, or the hardest death for many to accommodate, we give that sudden or hardest death to people with learning disabilities because we can't find the words, and some of us can't find the conversations to have them prepare for the death of someone very close to them. So we give people with cognitive abilities or changes in cognitive abilities, we give them that added complexity really by dealing with sudden death as opposed to anticipated or planned death. So the literature tells us that if you anticipate a death, then your recovery around bereavement post-death will be much easier. It's not going to be the best, but it'll be easier than the suddenness of a sudden unexpected death and all the challenges that that can bring. So death of any individual can only count if the individual counted in life. Yeah? So how we treat people in life is often mirrored in how we treat people in death. And the contributions that people with learning disability can be huge if only we looked for it, recognised and appreciated the contributions that they can indeed make to our understanding of what it means to live and to die with a learning disability. And I think this is really important. Death never occurs in a vacuum. It always occurs in a social context. And that social context is crucial in helping that person to cope with what's happening around them. So if that social context is supportive, if it's helpful, if it facilitates grief, then that person will more likely explore the grief and its impact in a healthy, sustained way than an environment that shuts grief down and doesn't attempt to communicate and talk to the person simply because they have a learning disability. So the social context is really important. And that social context can be different for so many different people. So this is a picture of St. John's Cathedral in Malta. It's not a very clear picture, but there's 375 memorial tombstones. So it's a very impressive place to visit. And I always think that death has many faces. Yeah, it can be our constant companion. It can be a sudden visitor, unexpected, unexplained, and suddenly it arrives. And I just think sometimes we need to be thinking that, you know, the nature of death means that it comes in many guises and it comes in many different ways. And this is a picture of the cemetery on Robben Island in Cape Town. Beautiful place to visit. And many of the people buried in this cemetery are people who died in the leper colony that was there before it became a prison. So death is often perceived as the ultimate loss and the only certainty within life itself. So on the continuum of losses, there's lots of things that we're exposed to throughout life. But I guess if we talked about loss in the general population, they would automatically think that death is the loss that we are meaning, whereas really there are lots of other losses, but I guess death is the ultimate, largely because it's irretrievable, largely because you know, it's the finality, and it's the end point for everybody. So death can be a regular companion, as I mentioned previously. For example, somebody with a life-limited condition, and they live with that prospect of an untimely death for many months or even years. It can be a sudden and unexpected visitor when it arrives without warning or time to prepare, and it can be perceived as untimely. Death can be a welcome friend for some people who've had enduring pain with no expectation of release. Then maybe death is welcomed. And death can be a stranger. For example, death and loss are shrouded in secrecy, and individuals are not allowed to know about death until absolutely necessary. For example, when the bereaved person has a learning disability.
Mom told me cats have 9 lives. I wish my mom had 9 lives. I miss her now. Nobody seemed to speak about her. It's like it's a big dark secret.
If we could understand the different ways that people react to loss, we understand something about what it means to be human. Something about the way we experience life and death, love and meaning, sadness and joy. And I guess if we took the time to listen to people with disability, if we took the time to explore, explain, and describe things in ways that people with disability can understand, much like the previous speaker helping her son survive the death of his father, then we would know what is the best way of supporting holistically and person-centred in a way that the person might understand. So what we know in the literature, listening to previous voices, is people do experience grief. We know that. We've got lots of examples over the years about people who've been exposed to grief in different contexts with a learning disability. We know that the impact of this grief is varied and often complex. And we know that response to bereavement by adults is similar in type, though not in expression, to that of the general population. So yes, adults with a learning disability, they feel the common responses to loss and death, such as anger, denial, sadness, guilt, ambivalence maybe, but they struggle in articulating and expressing that grief in a socially acceptable way that people can understand and appreciate. So they may do things that we wouldn't see as being grief work, and that could be maybe they do things more so than they did before, maybe they withdraw from doing the things they used to do. I remember working with a young lady. She was referred to me with a learning disability, and she lived in a home with other people with learning disabilities, and she had a fair number of complex needs, and she was referred because following the death of her close friend at the house where she lived, she started, well, she actually stopped not trashing her bedroom. So a regular feature of this lady's behaviour was that she'd get very upset occasionally, and the first thing she'd do is to mess about in her bedroom and destroy things that were important to her. Since the death of her close friend, she had never trashed the bedroom. And you might think, well, that's wonderful, that's a really good thing to happen. But fortunately for this lady, she had very close carers who recognised that any change in frequency, intensity, or normality for that person is an indication of distress. So they referred her to the bereavement counselling organisation where I was doing my research, and they asked for support because they recognised that this was her cry for help. She didn't know any other way to do it except by changes in her usual behaviour, which they felt was related to the loss of this close friend. The other thing that we know is that people with learning disability are prone to multiple and successive losses. So the death of a main carer of a person with a learning disability, or the death of their parents, perhaps in a road traffic accident, and they're the only other person left at home, brings additional successive and multiple losses for that person. So immediately that person would then go, if they haven't got any relatives, they would go into some form of respite care until social services could find a place where that person could rehouse and live the rest of their lives maybe. So straight away they've lost parents, they've lost familiarity in the home that they used to live in. They're now in a new environment, temporarily maybe, until it's all been sorted. But straight away they have a number of other losses that are totally out of their control, and that is largely because they have a learning disability and they're not able to stay on their own in that environment without their mum or dad. What else does the literature tells us? That people with learning disability have a significantly poorer understanding of the concept of death. So this is some research that we've conducted with colleagues in Sydney in Australia, and basically they may understand some of the basic sort of concepts around irreversibility and not coming back, but they don't know what death means, they don't know what death looks like, and sometimes the only way to explain that is by allowing people with a learning disability to go and see dead people in, for example, the Chapel of Rest, which is one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, really. So I guess taking somebody to see a loved one in the Chapel of Rest, what's important is that we prepare them beforehand. So I work with a small group of people whose friend had died in a home where they all lived together, and we prepared them with big pictures of what to expect. And I guess the key things to remember about going to see somebody in the Chapel of Rest is that they will smell things that will be different, they will see things that will be different, that the person they're going to see will usually be in a wooden box, they may be dressed differently, they may wear a dress, shroud, they might smell incense, they might see candles, and it'll be a very peaceful place, and the person in that box will no longer be able to talk to them, they won't be able to touch them, and they won't react if they touch them themselves. So we prepared this small group of people, and me and a couple of carers, off we go to the Chapel of Rest, and we go in, and it's a very quiet place, and we prepared beforehand. The Chapel of Rest knew we were coming, and we all stood round this coffin with their friend in. And you know how you get this intuition that something is not quite right. And some of the people I was with, they started nudging each other and having little whispers and something asides. So I said to one of them, "Is there a problem here?" And one of them said, "That isn't Jack. Jack was longer than that. And in here he looks really short in this shroud, you know." So what we had to do was lift the shroud up and show him the feet, so people could see the actual length of their friend, because the shroud he was wearing made him look different. So you can prepare lots of things, but be prepared at the last minute to also adapt to the needs of the individual when you're actually in that situation, particularly if it's a sensitive situation. But we felt we handled it reasonably well, really, but even we weren't fully prepared for what was about to happen. So people with learning disability may be less self-determined about end-of-life planning, and that's largely because they're not included in thinking about the end of life, because many parents, many professionals, they don't want to get in that sensitive business. They fear they're opening up a can of worms, and yet some of my friends who have a learning disability, they're fully prepared for what will happen when they die. One person I know has even got his plot next to his mother at the local cemetery, and that is where he's going to be buried. So it doesn't frighten him. He looks forward with anticipation, because he knows his final resting place will be with the person he loved most in the world, which was his mother. And in the work we did with Sydney in Australia, people with disability have a greater fear of death, because maybe we don't talk about it enough. In our society generally, we don't always talk about death and dying in the pub or the local restaurant. We only do so if it's in the social media. So if someone who's very famous has died, such as Princess Diana, then automatically the whole world is buzzing and the whole communities are buzzing. But it's not an everyday conversation that you would engage in, or all these issues around death, loss, and dying.
If I was in heaven with my mum, there would be little cafes in which you don't need to pay money, and it will be free.
What an idyllic representation of heaven. But that's what she believed in, or hoped for, maybe. So this is a picture of the oldest cemetery in Baltimore. You can tell everywhere I go I like to take photos of different parts of the world around death and dying. So what we do know from the literature is that people with learning disability are extremely vulnerable from a death and dying perspective, and that's because they're actively excluded from death and dying. They need more thoughts and practical interventions, like I've just talked about, in preparation. So often many professionals don't have the skills or the confidence to talk about such sensitive topics. And the more complex the needs, the less likelihood of being actively involved in this death and dying continuum. So if a person, for example, with a learning disability is referred to a hospice because they have been diagnosed with cancer, then the hospice may be a little anxious at taking somebody with a learning disability. If that person with a learning disability, who also has cancer, has some form of communication impairment, and that is recognised on the referral papers, then they are less likely to be actively involved in death and dying, and the hospice or other professional services may be less reluctant to support them, because it disables them, the actual professionals themselves. If a person has a learning disability, has cancer, has communication impairments, and is also labelled as having challenging behaviours or difficult behaviours, then organisations and people within them may become less likely to involve them or to know how to handle them if they are not from the learning disability world in terms of professional expertise. So the more complex the needs, the less likelihood people with disability may be involved in the business of death and dying. And quite often this leads to what we recognise as being disenfranchised grief. So disenfranchised grief is when certain groups of society are not allowed to do the things they should or want to do at the time of death. So Ken Docker identified people with mental health issues, prisoners, children and young people, the older population, and people with a learning disability, who are these, or some of these groups that because of their labels, because of where they are, such as prisoners, they may be discouraged from doing what they need to do at the time of death. So he identifies it as being grief that people experience when they incur a loss that cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. And he catalogues disenfranchised grief as when the relationship isn't recognised. So mum never visits him, so why should we tell him that she's died, because he doesn't even know who mum was. I'm not condoning that. I think everybody has a right to know when their relatives are dying or who have died. When the loss isn't recognised, so if someone with profound and multiple disabilities who doesn't communicate verbally, maybe some people will be reluctant to explain to the person because they don't know how he'll receive it or how he'll respond to it. And this is similar to the griever not being recognised. So, you know, maybe he won't understand, or he won't understand the full impact. That doesn't mean we shouldn't tell them. And he later talked about the ways that individuals grieve, so how the impact is recognised and supported. And he also added the circumstances. So this idea about it being the social context is really important around that death.
I never got to say goodnight to my granddad. Our brother with dad with his boots on. I know he's up there. He's looking down at me as we speak. Get out, granddad.
Some research we conducted a few years ago in Cardiff and in England, and this was to explore the experiences of people with disability who'd had a bereavement or loss issue, and we conducted focus groups in both parts of the country, and we were struck by the number of losses and death experiences that they'd had, and it became a fundamental feature of everyday life for many of the people in our groups. We were struck by the normality of loss and grief, how they talked about it. It was just as if it was an everyday occurrence. We were also struck by the importance of pets. I mean, we know that pets play a huge role in many people's lives, and they do so for people with learning disability too. They were not afraid to contemplate their own death. They were more worried about how other people would view their own death. So yes, I might die, but how will my mother cope if I died? So it was that sort of experience. And supporting staff who were with the people in our groups, they were surprised at the extent to which death had coloured and touched the lives of the people they knew well, but hadn't had these conversations with them because we just don't have such sensitive conversations. So we found in our research that people with learning disabilities were eager to talk. They worried about other people. And worried about the death of other people. They wanted to share it, they wanted to share their experiences, and we found that even though they were open to talking about bereavement, they had far less contact with dying people, and we called it the hidden face of dying. So they didn't know when people in their family circles were dying. They only knew after the event on many occasions, and they wanted to be informed about those deaths. So what are the challenges? Why is hearing the words so incredibly difficult for this population? So often communication is the key. Often the person lacks an appropriate verbal repertoire, so they can't say it feels like this, this and this. They may just do things. They may illustrate their grief in many, or demonstrate their grief in many different physical ways, such as withdrawing and maybe deciding not to wash or dress or do things that we expect. The support person may not know how to communicate effectively, so people caring for the person with a disability may lack that verbal repertoire to initiate those sensitive discussions. There's uncertainty about what has been absorbed or understood. So many years ago, one of the earlier clients I took with a learning disability, I was referred to this person because of antisocial behaviours, really, in a new home that he was living in. And I went to meet this person, and it transpired that this person who was ageing, he was an older person, and we discovered that he had a sister who had a learning disability too, but not only that he had actually been with her when she died. So one of the first things we actually tried to do was to find out where the sister was buried. So we checked all the local records. I think there's 9 burial centres in our vicinity, and until fairly recently these were manual records. Now they're all electronic, which is much easier. Anyway, we found this burial place, this sister, and she didn't have a headstone. It was just a plot number. So we prepared this young man, this older person, for going out to see this plot, and I was really anxious that it didn't have any recognition that it was where she was buried, but my biggest concern was that it didn't have a dustbin or a path or a gate or something across it, because you never know what you're going to find when you're trying to find plots that have been unmarked in any way, shape or size. So we went out to find this plot, and he was he was fine. He wasn't distressed. He was fairly unresponsive. We explained when we got there, the plot, it was a bed of yellow tea roses. So it was a beautiful space that we found where his sister was buried. So we explained to him what it was, etc. And I was thinking, I wonder if he knew and how much he knew about what we were doing with this gentleman. As we turned to leave, he bent forward and he broke off one of the yellow tea roses, and he gave it to me and said, "In case you forget where she's buried." So sometimes we don't know how much has been absorbed or understood, but increasingly people with disability, they really surprise me by their understanding of what we're trying to help them to understand in this business of death and dying. And I still have that pressed flower somewhere in one of my books. And another challenge is that counselling is perceived as talking therapy, and many of our people with a learning disability don't have that talking therapy repertoire that might be so needed. So, building on the work that the previous speaker talked about, we have to be very creative in how we support people with disability. So pictures, booklets, taking them to cemeteries, taking them to show them places, and creating life story books, memory books are really important to this population. So this combination of cognitive ability, attention span, and limited vocabulary, low expectations, stereotyping, and stigma associated with having a disability, and also the death and dying areas, and limited experience of grief and grief rituals, they all compound to make death and dying so very difficult for our population. Emphatically about attitudes, and Maureen Osby many years ago, she coined this phrase, the double taboo, death and disability, which tried to explain why it was difficult to engage in conversations that are very sensitively hard to hear. How death is conceptualized. I mean, how do you describe death to somebody without it being a concept? How do you explain it in concrete terms? The easiest way for me is to take somebody to see what a dead person looks like, etc. Parents and carers tending to focus on the symptoms rather than addressing the cause. So this is where we tend to address what they're doing rather than finding the root of the problem. So having a medication review is a short-term measure, but eventually they'll still miss the person and they'll manifest that grief and that loss in another way that will get attention. And I have to say this is one of the first things I ever wrote many years ago about lack of appropriate training and education, support and supervision, particularly around supporting this group. In some of the homes I work with, lack of record keeping. We can't find where people are buried, or where people's relatives may be buried because they never went to the funeral. Maybe people with disability lack heritage and history. They lack the appropriate assessment format, so we don't know how to assess whether somebody needs support or not. The lack of empirical research, although we have more research now than we ever had around this topic. This results in grief being unnoticed, grief being ignored, and ultimately disenfranchised grief.
What actually helps now, what you could have done 12 months ago, 15 months ago, is having that work for counselling at the Duff Centre. The Duff Centre is for bereavement and loss. They're counsellors that listen to you, with your concerns, and you can self-refer to the Duff Centre. But it's really good to have really good friends that you can talk to about loss and bereavement.
So having support helped Carl significantly in being able to talk about the death of his father. And if we think more about disenfranchised grief, what Docker argues is that we really need to acknowledge the loss and legitimise the emotional pain of that loss. So for people with learning disability, that's about finding a way to connect, finding a way in, which the previous speaker was very, very creative and spoke very powerfully about how she did that. It's about active listening, and I describe that as active listening as listening with my whole body and not just listening with my ears. Empathy, making sense of life experiences, and meaning making, trying to find benefits somewhere, somehow, in what's happened in that experience. And it's about sharing fears and anxieties, spiritual support, it's about support groups, and it can be about counselling for some people with a learning disability.
I'm sitting here waiting for my taxi. It's usually me and my mum is sitting here waiting for my taxi. She usually stops off at the flower shop. I always say, "See you later, alligator." She says, "In a while, crocodile." And I go the rest of the way off to college. Oh, there's taxi. Come on, Mum.
So sometimes just being able to describe or explain how things used to be and some of the things that you used to do can be really powerful, even for a person with disability. So Ken Docker talks very strongly about the powerful and constructive use of ritual. I'm not going to read these things out, but the most common one would be funerals, the rites of passage, celebrating the life of a person. And we know that in many ways funerals are very much about the living and not just about the person who's died. So lots of different types of rituals, such as rituals of affirmation and rituals of reconciliation. So in terms of counselling, many years ago, Susan Conboy Hill, she talked about access to ordinary counselling services would be ideal, but as yet the practitioners within these services are not geared to our clients' needs, and the services may not be free. So many organisations are awakening to the needs of people with a learning disability, and the fact that we do need to be a bit more creative, and that their generic counselling skills may not be enough when supporting a person with a disability. And I describe bereavement counselling for people, particularly with a learning disability, as the skill facilitation of the individual's response to loss through purposeful communication within a caring relationship, forged upon trust and mutual regards. And the core conditions, as in other counselling relationships, are fundamental and crucial. But then I go on to say that such skill facilitation may involve a range of activities in addition to the spoken word, such as memory books, art, photographs. And this is a media or different medium through which the counsellor can access the individual's thoughts, feelings and inner dynamic world in an effort to engage with their sadness, understand their pain and help the person to explore their feelings of grief in a very constructive way. So in terms of where we are now, I mean, I think current perspectives, grief support is at its best inconsistent. So if you go to various parts of the country, you'll get different support opportunities. Depends where you live. And at worst, it's non-existent. So in some parts of the country, maybe people with learning disability get no opportunities at all. It very much depends on that context in which they live. Maybe the family context, or maybe if they live in a home or supported environment. So in conclusion, death and dying rate sensitive issues for everyone, regardless of whether you have a learning disability or not. But they can be more challenging for some people or for some groups of people. And collaborative working is the key to effective support. So bringing different perspectives, different professionals, bringing groups of people with learning disability together. We can work reactively, in other words, after the event, but we can also work proactively. So we can talk with people with disability before anything that might be happening in the future, to get them to talk openly about their fears, their worries, what would they want to happen to them, and what they fear most about their family and friends in the future if we ask them about loss and grief. And people with learning disability are likely to experience profound and multiple losses across the lifespan, many of which are invisible and as such go unnoticed, unrecognised and unsupported. One of the most common losses, in addition to the death loss, if you like, is transitional loss. So many people with learning disability, maybe they move services, maybe they move houses, maybe they're carers, they're professional carers, maybe they move services and move on. And sometimes, you know, the staff group might have a party to celebrate somebody leaving, but how often do we support the person with a learning disability in that transition of that movement in some way? So it's about breaking bonds and helping them to understand that we can still contact people afterwards and we can still write to people or email people, etc. So we can continue the bonds and threads of loss in a constructive way. So what have I learned on my journey in working with people with disability over the years? I guess my primary one would be to be humble, that they teach me so much about disability and about loss and about living and dying with a disability. To never be afraid to ask for help from somebody. Somebody out there is more likely to be able to help you if you just dare to say the words. People with learning disability are largely like everyone else. We just need to find a way to communicate in a way that they understand and they appreciate. And that people with learning disability have stories to tell and can teach us so much in terms of what they've done and how they need to mourn their dead in the way that we do. And in the words of Mitch Albom, no soul remembered is ever really gone. So the more we can create and ensure that continuing bonds are there with the deceased, then the person is more likely to remember them. For people with learning disability, those continuing bonds need to be in more physical formats, such as pictures, life storybook, memory books, things that they can touch and stroke and feel, maybe.
Your body turns into a skeleton, but you still have a soul, so you have to enjoy life as it comes.
I don't think I'm bragging, but it helps if I talk about it.
When I die, I know I'm going to be with people I love.
So thank you very much. That ends my